Hi, everybody. So today we're talking about risk assessments in family daycare. And you might be surprised to know that this is not only about the risks that we have, that we carry as service providers and as educators, it's not only about the risks that we carry to children. So like always, give me 4 seconds to share my screen with you and we can get today's presentation started. So let me just make sure, can you see my, you know me. Oh, yep. Okay, beautiful. So risk assessment and risk management in family daycare. So as I said to you, today we're going to be talking about a number of risks, and they're not only just the risks to children, risk to reputation, risk to finances, risk to all those things. So how you can conduct your own risk. And this one is, I think I've got some scenarios in here for you that you can have a little look at too as you go through. Many of you know me already, but just in case this is the first time you've met me, my name's Jodie Signorino, and I've been a governance and leadership advisor for the family daycare sector for the past 6 or 8 years, I suppose. But I've been a governance and leadership advisor for almost 16 years across the board in all different service types. I've got 30 years experience in education and care service delivery. I'm early childhood trained. I've got qualifications in human services, training and business, and I do a lot of consultancy. So I work on the road safety education program with Ella. I currently work as an inclusion support professional with Community Childcare Association. I live in Melbourne. I have one child who is almost an adult, and I'm always looking to advance my training. So I'm looking at doing different things. And whatever that looks like. I'm currently thinking about law. So that's where I am. I am going to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I like to give my gratitude at this point because the traditional custodians are our First Nations people, have been doing this for millions of years, and they seem to have mastered this approach to early childhood and how we embrace early childhood and how it does take a village to raise a child, so to speak. So I really do genuinely pay my respects to First Nations people, and I'm learning a lot more as I go, because I think that that's part of our obligation for all of us, is to learn a lot more. And I came from a point in time where I went to school and we didn't really learn much of our First Nations history. And so I'm immersing myself in those studies and learning so much more as I go. So thank you to everybody. All right, so let's get started. Risks. Risks often in family daycare is the biggest risk that I see sitting where I am, and you may see me in a number of forums. The biggest risk that I see is that clarity around the roles and responsibilities and what those service agreements really mean to everybody. So we do know that the service agreement with both the state regulatory authority and the federal regulatory authority sits with the approved provider. The agreement between the educator and the approved provider is different again. So what that means is, when it comes to designing policies, when it comes to setting fees, when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to making decisions for the organisation, that really does sit with the approved provider. Now, that's not to say that the approved provider should just, pardon me, I've got hiccups, should just ignore educators. That really is around that agreement between each individual educator and the approved provider. That's negotiated between those two. But the approved provider has to meet the obligations of the service agreement, whether that be state or federal, with the regulatory authorities. So that's why sometimes you may hear me say things that you may not want to hear, which is that really is not your decision as a family daycare educator. That really does sit up there with the approved provider and the regulatory authority. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions that I see, in the sense that, maybe not a misconception, that's one of the biggest risks that I see. So sometimes, and I'll give you an example of that, we had an educator a couple of weeks ago, and that educator was charging additional fees for additional things, which was fine if that were in the educator's fee schedule. And we do have videos on this channel around how Educators can set their fees and do their costings and those sorts of things, but you can't be charging educators, you can't be charging families additional fees. You can't be terminating families. That's all got to be done in consultation with your approved provider, because that's where the agreement sits, and that's also where the liability sits. So as a governance advisor, we often speak a lot about liability and what that looks like. So now, that's not to say that if you ever feel unsafe or any of those sorts of things, you need to go straight to your service provider. And if somebody is being really unsafe, yes, of course, you can get rid of them from your home. But as far as terminating the employment contract or anything along those lines, that really does sit with the approved provider. So there is the agreement with the regulatory authorities, and then there is the agreement between yourselves as a family daycare educator and the service provider. Okay. We talk a lot about risk to children, there's no doubt about that. And we talk about visitors and transportation, residents, falls, dogs. So we talk about a number of risks to children. And I used an example recently in a training that was, I went to an educator's home, a family daycare educator's home, and the educator was, in an effort to make more room for the children, had pushed the table out of the way so that there was space in the kitchen area for the children to do what they did. But inadvertently, the educator had pushed the table closer to quite a big fish tank. I'm going to say at least 2 meters long. And the children that were in attendance were 2, 4, and 7. So when the table got pushed up towards the fish tank, and then there was the chair under the table, so there was the chair, the table, the fish tank. So when we look at that from a risk perspective with a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 7-year-old, we really need to determine what is that risk. So the risk is obviously drowning because of such a big fish tank. The likelihood of the risk, well, let's have a look at that. This is where I want you to think a little bit more about risk. So the likelihood, would that be sitting with the 2-year-old, the 4-year-old, or the 7-year-old? So if we look at that, the risk is much, much higher with the 2-year-old, because the 2-year-old can climb from the chair to the table to the fish tank. The risk is much higher to the 2-year-old because the child's head is fully grown, so that's physical development. If the child were to fall into that fish tank head first, the child wouldn't have the capacity to get themselves out. There is also the risk for the 4-year-old, although very different to the 2-year-old. And of course, there is a risk for the 7-year-old. Although the 7-year-old, we're now down to, it's unlikely that the 7-year-old would fall into that fish tank and drown. So the risk is greater for the 2-year-old. It's likely for the 2-year-old, for the 4-year-old, and not so likely for the 7-year-old. So by understanding early childhood development and the physicality and the developmental stages of children, then you can have a more, I suppose, a more targeted risk, and your risk is a little bit more realistic than just saying, yes, there's a risk of drowning, even though those children differ over those ages. So the risk does vary depending on the ages of the child. So it is really important when you are developing your risk assessments and looking at the risks within your program that you are considering early childhood behaviours, early childhood development, and what that looks like. So age appropriate. So we need to be taking all of those considerations into our risk assessments. I don't know why I've got working with children screenings, but we need to have that. So yeah, I'm just going to keep moving forward. All right. The other risks that you guys have in family daycare is financial risks. You have a reputation risk, you have a rating risk, and you can be putting family daycare service providers at risk for their approval. So sometimes that's why they may come down on you hard, and then you are also risking your registration. So let's unpack that for a second. We often see in family daycare that the risks financially to you, particularly as family daycare educators, is quite great. So a family that holds, as I said, they hold the agreement, the enrolment agreement between themselves and the service, and they just decide to not come any longer or not pay any late fees or not do whatever it is which the service provider is responsible for putting that fee structure in place. Often what happens is we see that family daycare educators go without those finances. Now, if you've listened to me before, you know that that's one of my passions for you guys. I do not want you going without money. You work too hard for what you do, how you work. what you earn, your worth, all those sorts of things. So we want to really mitigate those risks to make sure that you're not missing out on any kind of income or anything like that. So we can see that if a family is disgruntled about something, then there's a really good chance that they may terminate their enrolment. We know that there are CCS rules around that and what that potentially looks like. So these are the risks that we do have, particularly as family daycare educators, and I speak with approved providers every day about this risk also. We also, depending on how you manage those kind of risks, and because you are the family daycare educator, which means in that model, you are the face often. So even though a family member might be disgruntled with the service based on the service's policies and those sorts of things, you're kind of the face of that. So if they do terminate their contract with you, or if they do terminate anything, then they go back to, they might go back to their friends, they might go back to their colleagues, and they will, I suppose, be derogatory to you. Oh, do you know in this service that I went to, do you know what they did? Do you know what they did? So in one way, they might not be talking about you even as the family daycare educator. They're talking about the service provider, essentially. So we do see that risk to reputation. So we want to really monitor that. And then you don't also, the other risk to your reputation is if you've got the service has a range of non-compliances, and it may not be you as an individual educator, it might be another educator, it might be the service itself. So what are those risks, and what is that reputation that you're getting in the sector? What are the regulatory authorities? Where are you sitting with your ratings and assessments? So there's a whole lot of considerations around reputation. And that also leads us into the ratings. So we know that with service providers, they get rated as a service, and the assessors will come out and assess a number of family daycare educators. And we know that those timeframes are really short. So you might get anywhere between 1 and 5 days notice that you'll be being assessed. So if you're not really ready, or if the service isn't ready, then you're rating, the service that you're registered with may be rating at working towards, could be worse, working towards, but ideally we want to be meeting and above. That's ideally what we want to do. So if you've got some things that are really not happening, that can be a risk to the ratings of the service. The other thing is with real risk. Now, the real risk is, and I'll give you an example of this, the real risk is we had an educator recently who was doing regular transportation with children. The children were in car seats that were ill-fitted. They weren't properly fitted to the car. So the approvals, because of the magnitude of that risk and because of the transportation of children, that provider's approval is now at risk. So we want people to be really aware of what kind of risks affect what aspect of what we do. And if you are registered with an approved provider or a service provider, and you've got a number of different things that you may be really not sure of, or they've tried to help you and you're not there, you don't have the attitude to do this, you're not committed to this, then that can be a risk to your registration. So often approved providers will say, no, sorry, you can't do it. So often what happens in that case, if it's different to an employment arrangement where if you're not really getting the job or you're not really getting all those tasks, there is generally a process in place where they can say, like, hey, Jode, you're not really getting this. We're going to offer you some training. We're going to do this and we'll support you through. Often that doesn't happen in family daycare, and we'll see that in many cases, the family daycare educator is just sometimes, sent a letter in the mail and saying your services are no longer required. Thank you, but no, thank you. So we do see that risk to your reputation. To your registration, sorry. Okay, so conducting risk assessments. And you know what, I've done this for a really long time, and I've had people give me some feedback and over the past, and they've said things like, oh, you look at things in a negative and it's all, and look, yes, I probably do have a look at things through a deficit perspective. So, and I always do look at, particularly as a governance advisor, like, what is the risk? Where is the risk? What is the potential outcome of this risk? Is it a risk to finances? Is it a risk to children? Where do we prioritise this risk? How do we stop this risk? And how do we move forward? How do we minimise? How do we mitigate? How do we eliminate? So that's a lot of what we do. So we know that you conduct your risk assessments before children even commence care. So that's about risk to children and safety. It's also a really good idea to have a risk assessment process or a risk assessment way of thinking in almost everything you do. So if you have a parent complaint, then rather than say, oh, this parent just complained, what is the risk assessment to that? And how can you manage that? Because often, and I have that way of thinking also, that if one person is complaining or raising a grievance about something, there's a really good chance that there's a number of other people or some other people that may be feeling that. It may not just be about the individual, and it may be, but that's a really good time to sit back and say, you know what? If somebody's complaining about this, then this is a really good opportunity for me to have a look at some of my practices, some of my processes, and see whether there is really a risk there. We know that every visit that the service provider does for you is essentially a risk assessment. So, and I advocate for that as far as the service provider. Every time they go in, it is around supporting and improving practice and resourcing, and it is absolutely around that. But at the same time, approved providers need to be conducting some kind of risk, and it's not always about risk to children, so it's not necessarily about that checklist. It can sometimes be a risk assessment, can sometimes be around attitude. A risk assessment can sometimes be around, whether you're, as the family daycare educator, is getting burnt out, or you're overworked, or have you overcommitted yourself. So it's really about the approved provider making sure that you're really safe in your role too. And we also talk about, and I talk about this a lot with approved providers, is going back over your documentation, and you can identify, and I'll give you an example of that. So you might get all of 2020's incident records that you've had over the year, and children fall, children have illnesses, children have bumps, children have scratches, children will argue sometimes, children will hit children, we have biters in this age group. So there's a number of incident reports that you can reflect on. But I worked with a service once, and we looked at all of their incident reports over a 6-month period, and we noticed there was an increase on a Wednesday between 3 and 5, that they had more accidents in that period of time than they did in any other period of time. So what did that do? When we looked at those incident reports upon reflection, that highlighted to us that either there's something wrong between that period of time, and it came down to a dynamic between children. So it was a 7-year-old that was targeting a 5-year-old, and that was where the incident was happening. So although the incidents were subtle and the educator may not have picked it up at the time, upon that aggregate reporting where we get all of our information together and we reflect on that, we could find that pattern, and we looked at that. So make sure you don't leave your reporting that long, or your reflections that long. So have a look at you can have a look at your compliments register, you can have a look at your complaints register, you can have a look at your incident reports, you can have a look at a whole range of documentation. And it doesn't need to be a big, full-on task, but just reflect on that and have a little look at what that looks like. And sometimes that will highlight something in your practices or in your service, or what that looks like. Near-miss incidents. Oh, my Lord, I cannot tell you how important near-miss incidents are. Near-miss incidents, they should be documented. So if you've got, you might have 2 steps that go out into the rear of your property, and you've had 1 or 2 people, or yourself, or 1 or 2 children skid on that, then that's a near miss, because you might fall down that back step. And if you're the educator, you might fall down those 1 or 2 steps and really hurt your back and be incapacitated. So that's a near miss. So, we all do it. We have a little slip, we have a little fall, we do whatever, and we might go, oh, gee, that's not really great anyway, and just keep getting on with our day. By recording near misses, then you really are preventing accidents from happening. So you might decide that to put a non-slip grip on the back. You might decide to, if you've got another exit that you could use, maybe you'll change that exit around. So your near misses really should be recorded, and make sure you pay attention to your near misses, because they will keep you, the children, the families, and the service safe. So we talk about near misses a lot. Okay, regular outings. Regular outings are sometimes, some of the regular outings that I review for services, they can be They cover a range of things, but they're not really contextualized to the actual risk that you're taking. So if we have a little look at this one here, and you can Google these addresses and what that is. And one of the reasons why I talk about this risk assessment is this one that walks through two parks. One of them is an off-lead park and one of them is an on-lead park. And if we apply the scenario to the 2-year-old, the 4-year-old and the 7-year-old, then what are those risks? And those risks will differ because of the age development of the children. So if you've got all 7-year-olds, it would be different. If you've got all 2-year-olds, it would be different. If you've got a range of ages, then it would be different. And who is more at risk? So if we look at it, in this case, if with an off-lead park, if a dog should happen to run up, the child most likely developmentally would be the 4-year-old to run. So the child at risk in that scenario would be the 4-year-old. So we've got to have a look at that. And when you go through your regular outings, make sure that you are contextualizing the children that you're taking with you and what that potentially looks like and where that risk lies. Oh, I spoke about aggregate reporting. Okay, now you might want to screenshot this because these are a couple of scenarios that I give to people sometimes just to determine where they are as far as their risk approach. Now, when you think about these, I always advise that you refer backwards and forwards to the legislation so that you get a really good understanding of the legislation or the national framework or all that sort of stuff and what that looks like. And make sure you to include in any of these scenarios, what are the notification periods. Some of these you may have come across before. I'm sure most of you are fabulous at your risk assessments, but here's just these are just another way to kind of think about what risks do, what does happen in family daycare, what potential risks are involved to you, and how you can mitigate those risks. Because my goal is, it's always time. We want you to be safe as family daycare educators. That's one of my passions and goals for you. Have a look at, as you do your risk assessments, your regular outings, those sorts of things. Review your policies. The regulations clearly state that your policies have to be followed. So if you're looking at your policies while you're going through this process, make sure that you're providing feedback to your approved provider so that policies can be reviewed. Oh, we've done that. Okay, sorry, I doubled that last screen up. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Have a little think about your risks and what they are for you, and please make sure that you're safe, and please record any near misses because they are really important. And you can see my kitten here has joined us now, and I think he joined us last week also. Have a great weekend, and I will see you as we go. And welcome to our new subscribers. We've got quite a few new subscribers now, so welcome everybody, and I hope you enjoy these videos. Please make sure you subscribe because then we can sort of keep this channel growing and moving. And if you've got anything in particular that you want addressed from a governance perspective, please let me know. Happy to do these short, no fluff videos for you guys so that you can get yourselves and your services on the right track and you are safe and protected and the children in your care are safe and protected. And here is Alfie, who is being a little bit cheeky. All right, enjoy your weekend. I will see you next week. See ya. Bye.